Good evening, everybody, and welcome to week 4 of our free short course presented by Charles Sturt University and IT Masters on the Internet of Things. And as always this evening, while we're waiting for everybody to just come out of the foyer and into the main room, we'll just give everybody 5 minutes. So we will go silent for the next 5 minutes, but in the meantime, feel free to chat, tell us how you're feeling on this lovely day, and we will take it from there. So I'll speak to you again in a few minutes. Thanks. This is our 4th week of the Internet of Things. This week we're calling it More Comms, More Data, because that's what we do. It's all about comms and data. And I think, as always with the housekeeping, feel free to keep chatting amongst yourselves in the chat section. Tell us where you're from, what you're up to. Maybe let us know if you've got a special interest in the topic. I saw from last week's chat that a couple of people were doing projects. I think somebody was doing a project with meat or something, and why you might be interested in the Internet of Things. While I think about that as well, we sent out a reminder today for everybody that's enrolled in the course to take the survey, which is past the exams in the list of things that are available, and to let us know what you think about the course. As I said briefly at the end of last week, we are considering whether we can do more with the Internet of Things in our curriculum, in which case, we'd like some feedback on what's good, what's bad, what you like, what do you want to see more of. So there's plenty of room to write stuff in there as well as do the preset questions. For the questions from tonight, if you want Jeff and I to answer them, it's much better if you put them in the question answer section, the Q&A on the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, rather than in the chat, because the chat whizzes by often so quickly that we don't get a chance to catch them. And at least with the Q&A, we can work with them much better. Our fantastic moderator Lily is here. My name is Shane Murphy, and as you know, Jeffrey Jenkins is our resident expert on all things technical. Hopefully we'll get enough time to answer all the questions again tonight. I would like again to acknowledge tonight I'm actually webcasting from Wadawurrung country, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be with us online. Now, let's get started. But before I hand it over to Jeff, who's driving tonight, you may remember that last week we talked about, in fact, it was the week before, we talked a little bit about privacy and the Internet of Things, and a couple of articles came my way. I'm just now going to stick them in the chat one by one. The first one is a very salacious one from a not very salacious organization, the Australian Computer Society, which tells us that your car can now tell you, it can now tell the owners, i.e. the manufacturers of the car, if you've been having sex in your car or not. And in fact, people like Nissan have admitted that they are starting to collect data on people's sexual preferences and proclivities as part of the data they collect from within the car. And they're selling that data on as well. Even more so, of something a little bit more scary, was that MasterCard are selling, I think they reckon that there is a data broker in Australia that reckons he's got data, for example, on 85% of Australian consumers. And MasterCard have a lot of that data because they process about 28% of all the transactions. And they're picking up all of that data as well in their big, through their collection of your purchasing habits. So they can monitor where you're purchasing. They can actually then run predictive AI on it to see where you might purchase next and what you might purchase next, so that people can then target you with ads or whatever they want to do. So in terms of privacy, there's some of the things that are happening and really available to large organizations these days. So I think it's well worth keeping that in mind with everything that we're talking about. And if you're working in the design of an IoT project, have a think about privacy and security. Can people grab your data? Is the data you're going to use appropriate? Are you collecting too much data? Is it available to other people who might want to hack? All of those sorts of things are going to become very important as we go along. But tonight is More Comms, More Data, or More Comms, More Data, depending on whether you went to Adelaide or Melbourne or America. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeffrey. Good evening, Jeff. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you, Shane. How are you?
Very good. Beautiful sunny evening.
I'm sitting outside here on Wurundjeri country, which might put me at the University of Melbourne, but And I'm happy to endorse your acknowledgement as always. And I find that those references to security and privacy are very helpful. And I'm reminded of something you said in the previous week. Might have said it myself. That if your project is collecting data that you wouldn't like someone else to collect on you, then don't collect it.
Yes, Reagan in the chat's mentioned 4 letters, which are important, which is GDPR, the European standard. And that is great, but that's more a matter of, shutting the door after the horse is bolted. I think in many cases, it's more about trying to scare companies into not doing things than to do it. So be interesting to see how much effect GDPR have.
Yes, yeah.
And as Jesper's also said, it's good if the credit card company does know your buying habits so they can flag it as fraud. And that's right. There are positive sides of all this data. I'm not trying to make out that it's all a big sinister conspiracy. It's a complex issue.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think we all agree that some of it is worth collecting, and all of it is worth telling us that they're collecting.
Exactly.
Very good. So we'd like to use examples in this course, and I have chosen 2. I tried to choose a couple for tonight that are fairly complex examples because I like this idea that IoT designs and projects are becoming more complicated and much more capable and much more valuable in their application, particularly to environmental questions, to issues of ecology, sometimes to issues of politics as it relates to the environment. And those projects are likely to be complex, and they're likely to have multiple elements. And so I've chosen a couple that I think might fall into those categories. So one is what I've called the smart cow trough.
I'm glad of the hyphen. Otherwise, I thought it was a trough for smart cows.
Yes, indeed. Well, I did previously have the hyphen somewhere else, but I'd moved it. So it's a place where cows can drink, but it's enabled with IoT. And in the photo, they look like they might be leeches or whatever, but they're actually cows, and that photograph is doubtless taken with a drone. And so it's an overhead photo of some cows around a drinking, well, we wouldn't say trough here, but perhaps basin or something like that. And the second interesting and complex project that we'll talk a bit about is a vaccine delivery by drone. And I've given you a drone to look at to get that that imagination going in your minds. That looks a bit scary, that drone, and it's certainly not the sort of drone that's normally used for delivering vaccines. But I quite like the picture, and so I have used it throughout. But you might have to imagine something a little different for vaccine delivery. Both of our projects have a sort of African connection in a way. The delivery of vaccines by drone, because this is commonly happening in African countries, and I'm involved in my day job with the delivery of vaccines by drone in Malawi and in Mozambique, and soon enough some other African countries as well. And I know of projects that aren't the ones that I'm involved with that are doing a similar thing. But there might be 3 different drone companies delivering vaccines in Malawi. seems to be the one that everybody wants to be involved with. And those cows aren't in Africa, but when we start to talk about that particular example of the smart cow trough, then we will talk a little bit about groundwater in Africa. And I wanted to tell you a little story about that. When I was an archaeologist years ago, we worked in the Dakhla and CAGR oases in southwest Egypt. And the water table there, because the land is low, the water table is quite high. And if you sink a well, then water will flow out of that well. And it's lovely and warm. And after a solid day on the tools, actually, that's not what I did. I was the papyrologist, so I had a solid day just sitting reading text. But in any case, after a solid day, you felt like a bath, and you would go down to the spring where there was a big water tank, and you would bathe in this warm water, which was quite splendid. Egypt's a long way to go for a nice bath, but we did. And there was a lot of debate about groundwater at the time, and there were various views on it. The people who lived in the oasis liked to think that the water that came up under pressure from the pipe had flowed from the Nile and pretty much directly. And it was a reasonable view, except that every now and again these pipes would just stop flowing, and then nobody knew quite how to explain that. But we had a member of the team who was a hydrologist, and he was able, with a little chemistry set, to tell us how old the groundwater was. And most of that groundwater that was coming up through the pipe was 20,000 years old. And I always used to think that was a stunning fact to know, that water had been in the ground for 20,000 years, and in fact the geography of that place had completely changed over those 20,000 years. I'll tell you a little story about Henry before we move on. Henry, the hydrologist, when I first met him in the archaeological camp, he said we had an exchange of niceties, and he said, "I'm going on study leave." Came from the University of Toronto, and I said, "That's lovely. What are you going to do?" And he said, "I'll take a break, and then I'll work on my first book." And I said, "That's excellent. You're writing a book." He said, "No, I'm not writing it. I'm reading it." And that's a little bit like the hydrologist's manual. You don't write books. You investigate surface water. Shane, we can go on to that next page.
Mm-hmm.
And what I need to do before we look at our examples is I want to try and give themes for analysis of the example. So we're going to look at each example from the point of view of application. We're supposed to talk about applications and data tonight. So applications, logic, and opportunities. I especially want the third because one of the observations that comes out of this course is that IoT is full of opportunity. There's any amount of good stuff that we can do with some basic IoT skills and the investment of a tiny little bit of money. So it's really just up to us to get the good ideas and press on. And I want to give some examples of that as we go along. So what did I write? Emerging opportunities, especially opportunities to do something good or better, if you like. because as we know, there's a particular relationship to IoT to geography and environment and ecology, and we all need to be doing better in that space. And one of the opportunities that we have is to help each other to do better, to tread lighter on the planet than we do. And it's a lovely space to be involved with, IoT, because we can make a bit of a difference there if we want to. And I've got a mozzie on me here, but it's just one of those things. It must have been the reference to Egypt, I think. And of course, getting reimbursed because most of us aren't quite at the point where we can set up a charity. So we need to find ways to recoup some expense. And of course, the nice thing about IoT projects is that some of them, well-designed ones, do make money. There's a few that we've talked about in this course already that don't, but not everything is like a pet tracker. And some IT projects really thrive. Now,
Absolutely.
application design, we talked about this a little bit, and we'll come back to it as a theme of our analysis tonight. But we were reminded that there's a certain complexity and a certain distributed character for an IoT project, and forethought is critical. You need to plan. You need to design. You need not to buy a device off the shelf and deploy it in the field and then say what happens next. It's very important that you give it some forethought. And this especially, really, as an architect would, and this is especially true of security, you can't build security into an IoT project as an afterthought. You have to design it in. And so that's the point of application design, or one of them. And the other that we've stressed over and over is this idea of collaborating logic. There's lots of programming goes into an IoT project. And pretty much every node has some code running on it, all the way from the SIM card to the modem, maybe to a local server, to a cloud server, to a desktop where somebody is, whether they realize it or not, running some code interacting with an IoT project. And of course, whenever there's logic involved, then the modern questions are, is there an application for machine learning or even artificial intelligence? I think I'm inclined to talk more about machine learning than artificial intelligence for the moment. But in any case, you've got to design your application before you've got a space or a context in which AI could work. So thank you, Shane. We can look at our first example. I think that might be what comes up next.
Mm-hmm. Here we are, the smart cows.
The smart cows, yeah. I had one thing noted here, which I did want to mention in connection with security, and then not talk about again. And that is that key question: will my project work when it has to? Will it work when it has to? And that's part of your design. That's part of your forethought, to make sure that you design something which self-tests so that when it has to work, it will work, including sending reports that people notice. I don't know whether we've all been dismayed, whatever our politics may be. We've been completely dismayed at what happened in Israel and Gaza during the last week. But I was very intrigued to hear somebody say that there were lots of reports generated by the IoT, if you like, on the wall, but there wasn't anybody watching them. So it's so important in the design that we get that right.
That comes back really to the project design and having buy-in from the business, essentially. If you don't have buy-in from the business, nobody's going to look at the reports. They'll file them in a folder and they'll just watch the little numbers of unread messages go up. So it also relates to things like having cascading different levels of alarm. So if nobody's responded, and this was a feature of early SCADA systems many times as well. If there was a response time for a tier 1 alarm, and if nobody responded, it escalated to a tier 2 alarm, which would go to different people. And eventually it would just keep going up the chain until it got to somebody who would actually act upon the alarm, because it might be a oil refinery, a cracker or something starting to overheat and cause a potential problem. I was also thinking when you were talking before about the bushfires in Hawaii, where they had an early warning system for fires after the last few years, and it failed basically, I think, because it wasn't switched on more than anything else.
Yeah.
And as we know here in Australia as well, a number of the fire alerting systems fail simply because the radio towers and the cell towers get burnt out pretty quickly.
Yes. Yeah. It's a reason for applying some satellite technology to that context as well, Shane, and for another time we'll talk about it. But it's that conversation, isn't it, where everybody sits down at the table and says, we've got this idea, here it is on the whiteboard, these are the elements that we have to address. Security is one of them, and the sort of data that needs to be generated, is it one directional, two directional? We have to be able to address the devices and so on and so forth. That's that critical conversation, and so often we just leave that one out of consideration, and then we produce something that isn't very good. Well, you'll be pleased to see that I've taken more trouble over my diagrams than last week. Someone said that my hand-drawn diagrams left a bit to be desired. I thought they were good, but anyway. So I've taken more trouble this week, but I have to tell you that nothing here is to scale. Probably especially the sun, and so you shouldn't interpret the size of anything on the screen as relevant, and especially what you see at the top right in the middle, because this is a low Earth orbit satellite, what we will call it here a shoebox satellite. Nothing like it.
A TARDIS.
Nothing. So yes, nothing like it. Does look like a TARDIS, doesn't it? Nothing like as big as an Iridium satellite, say, which is, people like to say they're the size of a Volkswagen. I don't know why people choose Volkswagen in that connection, but seems to be popular for getting the size of an Iridium satellite. Well, this one's a shoebox, so it's really tiny, and as such, relatively inexpensive to launch and even to operate, and so that brings the price down of what we want to do with it. And here we want to monitor a smart cow trough. Now, if you look at the left, you'll see the smart cows in question. Half a dozen or more, one brown one, and they are drinking at the trough. I was going to say that they're not Australian cows, but cows that look a little bit like that you do find in Australia. Queensland, but where it is doesn't matter for the argument that we're going to use here, because the data about the trough can't be collected by definition in this example by cellular networks, even less by other local networks like LoRa and the like, Sigfox, but can be collected by some satellite service or other. So, and I've added some complexity to this design. You've got cows in a drinking trough. You've got a windmill, especially not to scale, which is pumping water into that trough. And then you've got a fairly substantial IoT setup, which I've described by some processes which are in the box, and we'll look at them in detail. They're in red. We'll look at them in detail in a little while. But you remember last time we talked about the Telstra track and monitor device. We might mention it again later, because it's been much talked about at the university today, and it's on my mind, so I might just blurt it out. But when we talked about gathering weather information to match the data entries. So if you had a device in a certain location with a certain speed and direction, then you might, as soon as you receive the reference, look up the relevant weather at that moment, at that place, and store that information too. And here you can do that because you've got a little weather station. You see wind speed, wind direction, temperature. There may even be precipitation measured by that little weather station. So I plugged that in there too. And all of this is operated by or powered by a solar panel, which is what's showing in the middle at the top. So it's talking to one of these shoebox satellites, and that's a bit of a limited communication. And so we will analyze the particulars of that in a moment. And that satellite is via an API storing data in the cloud. And that's what you see on the left with the light blue color. Data storage in the cloud. So anyway, the last element is somebody looking at the data. Now, there's a point to make before we turn over the page and look at each of these in detail from the perspective of our analysis, our 3 criteria for analysis. And that point to make is that that person is not actually just sitting there looking at reports that come from the cows drinking. He or she, I think it's a she in this case, is performing complex analysis on that information. But she is also sending information back along these communication paths via the satellite, via the cloud and the data storage, all the way to the windmill at least, if not all the way to the cows. So that's the overview of what's going on there. And I called this low Earth orbit IoT. And I did because particularly that TARDIS box in the center is a low Earth orbit shoebox, not costing us very much money, but not particularly punctual, as we'll see. Shane's going to go over the page. Very good. So we've got our 3 criteria. And if I find my notes here, I'll remember what they are. But in any case, they are here in our right.
I can read them out for you, Jeff. The first one is very remote.
Yes. Yes. But in any case, I'm let me make sure. Oh, you can still see me, Shane. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So the first criterion is application. And the point of this design is that this trough is a long way from anywhere. It doesn't move around, by the way. And it's always an important distinction to make. An IoT project involving some unit that moves will behave a completely different way and need to be designed in a different way from one that is a big concrete block that sits somewhere where you put it and will never move. Shane reminded us, I think, in the first session, that the way these devices, IoT devices, behave on cellular networks is very much a function of whether they move or not. And if they move, they will keep re-establishing a connection, or moving a connection with the network. If they stay still, they may just disappear altogether and no one will be the wiser. Something that you've got to be really attentive to in your design. Well, it's bidirectional. You might think it needs to be bidirectional, but it really does. And especially because some of the functions that are going on here, you need to be able to control. So, for example, it may be under certain circumstances that a testing of the water shows that the water is poor quality, and you don't want the cattle to actually drink it. So then you want to be able to release that water and refill the tank. But that's something normally you couldn't do unless you went there to do it. But an IoT project would allow you to do it, provided that you have bidirectional data. You're actually hearing from the project and talking to the project. And the coordination of that whole to and fro is frequently conducted via something in the cloud. And that has to do with such issues as static IP on SIM cards. And particularly if you have something in the center, like a brain for your project, which is running your code, then it takes the pressure off you to have static IP and the like. But the next item is more important by far. We only had one person sitting at a desk in the previous slide, but I like to think of these projects as the rancher and the researcher. Essentially, these projects get off the ground because the rancher is interested. The rancher wants to be confident that water is being pumped into the trough, and when the cattle come, that they can drink it. The rancher is very keen to know how many cattle are drinking at each drinking trough, and in fact, which ones. And he or she may want to do something if certain cattle go missing. And so they might have been stolen, for example. That happens very commonly. And if the rancher has 1 day's notice that 100 cattle didn't turn up for a drink, then they can take action promptly. Somebody, I think, might have just said in the chat, and I agree. So ranchers have a lot of benefit to knowing what's going on. And in fact, if they can get weather reports from particular locations, then that can significantly influence their decisions about how many stock they run on certain territories and the like.
I would imagine.
But it's not just the rancher. The value of these projects, even though the rancher might be driving it, the benefit might come to the researcher. So, for example, and here we want to talk about groundwater for a minute. It's a very important issue for our future on the planet, that we pay attention to groundwater, that we are careful, just as we try and avoid depleting fish stocks to the point where fish can't breed anymore and then we've got no fish. We are also wanting to be careful that we don't deplete groundwater. And of course, there's an analogy between those two. Fish, because we can't see them, if they're not there, we still can't see them. So it's easy for us to lose our fish stocks with just carelessness and lack of awareness. And the same is true of our groundwater. It's in the ground. By definition, you can't see it. And people sink wells here and wells there and wells anywhere else. And we're not really familiar with how many of those wells are drying up, what the depth of the water table is, and so on. Collecting that information is crucial for our futures. And that's true in Australia with the Great Artesian Basin. It's true of particular locations in Africa, and I think of the ones I'm familiar with in Egypt. And it's particularly true in India. And someone might be able to put a little note in the chat about the importance of that. Now, the other thing to mention here is and in fact, that note in the chat is relevant, as they all seem to be. We're talking about a distributed last mile here. So each cow is not talking to the box satellite. Each cow is, by whatever mechanism, a local wireless of some sort. It might be it'll be something around the cow's collar, a collar around the cow's neck, and it'll be talking wirelessly to the IoT box sitting beside the trough. And so that last mile is distributed. That is to say, that point of connection knows about several hundred cows, and it's therefore heavily distributed. Not each cow talking to the satellite, but each cow talking to some device or other which uses satellite. We call this backhaul. So the device on the ground talks to all the cows and then talks itself once to the satellite. And that raises a whole lot of questions that we'll deal with in the next slide. So here's the logic bit, and this is fun. I wrote a little list for you, so you see it there. There's input. So the cows are an input. Might be LoRa or Bluetooth or something else, but identifies the individual cows. The windmill has inputs. So its function, we might have a way of measuring the pressure. We might have a way of detecting the water table height. All of that is relevant. We would have a way of determining how much water flows through the windmill or through the windmill pipes. And we might be able to cross-calculate exactly how much water the cows have drunk if we allow for a little bit of evaporation based on what we know about the weather locally. So the weather itself too is an input. So then there are outputs, and I suppose you have to say there are outputs in both the direction of the satellite, and there might be inputs from the satellite and outputs into the direction of the trough. So these are bi-directional traffic. And I right at the bottom, I talk a little bit about the collection of the data. In a moment, we'll see that slide again, and you'll see that there's a database inside the box in the corner next to the trough. And that database is recording every detail imaginable, collecting all that information, not sending it to the satellite. There it is with the blue bands around it. Not sending it to the satellite, but just collecting enough so that if and when anybody wants all the data that were relevant over, say, a 1 year period, then they can ask that database for that information. Here I mention an old school friend of mine who had, I think, the very best December holiday job of any of us. He had an uncle who had a huge property in the Kimberley. And his job was every year he would go up there and he would load up a ute with all the equipment he needed, and he would visit all the windmills and he would repair them. And I remember from conversations with him that he would occasionally find one that had broken completely, wasn't pumping water, lots of dead cows. None of that do you want to see happen. And in the analogy of that process here is that an annual visit would be made to check on all this IT and the weather station and whatever else. But of course, you would know if it was dysfunctional almost instantaneously, because the satellite would carry a message to that effect. But you could collect then, as you went around, all of the data that was stored for the year. You'd had daily reports, but now you would have all of that data that was stored, collected on a USB stick, and bring it back to the homestead for processing. So how does this work? How do we make sure that the information about, say, 200 cows each day gets reported to the satellite? And here we want to talk about what's called exception processing. So this is the idea, you can imagine, that if cow number 100 drinks at the trough today and drinks at the trough tomorrow, then if you've told the system via the satellite that cow number 100 drank at the trough today, and you don't report cow 100 tomorrow, then you assume that it also drank at the trough on the next day. So, but if you do report, then what you report is cow 100 did not turn up today. So imagining the circumstance in which 160 cows come almost every day, all you need to say really is so much water was consumed today, and this is the state of play of all the devices, the windmill and so on, and cow 64 was absent.
Cow 64, where are you?
Yes, indeed. Yes, yeah.
It's very much like using. So this is a repeat of the SMS instance in many respects, and it's using the same techniques that we used with SMS some years ago, and still are to some extent, where you try to cram many hundred of characters worth of information into 144 SMS before concatenated SMSs were a thing, and it seems that there is a cycle of networks growing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and having much higher throughput pipes. And so you build your applications to cope with that and to deal with that. And then you want to expand the range, like into satellite range where there's no other communication networks. And again, you have to limit your communications, and you go back to the exception processing model, which really goes back to SCADA and SMS and other sorts of very low bandwidth applications. And I'm assuming that LEO satellites in this case are processing messages in much that same way, Jeff.
Yes, because you're probably not getting more than a message every 6 hours, and that message might be only about 140 characters, 140 bytes, say. And if that's the case, then you can't afford to waste anything there. And so but you would really like to be able to identify the cows individually, and that's a way to do that by just saying this cow's missing. And of course, if you then reported a dozen cows missing, then that would be significant, and somebody would want to do something about that.
Well, cows about a couple of $1,000s each, isn't it, in the local market?
Yes, indeed, indeed. And all of these suggestions that I see fly by on my screen, Shane, are all really good suggestions that would enhance a design like this. We wanted to do something that was sort of bare bones, but had a degree of complication about it, so that we can get that sense that this is bidirectional. It's complex. It involves satellite comms, but it isn't expensive to run, and it is capable of generating the sort of data that is the basis for not only running the property, but also doing sophisticated and important ecological research. Good. I'm sorry about my screen. I'm probably getting dark here, am I?
A little bit, as am I.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. But everybody will understand. I become a bit difficult to hear when it's dark, but we'll see how we go.
Right.
Thanks, Shane. I think we can go to a next one.
That'd be good, because time is of the essence.
Yes, yeah, good. All right, shoeboxes. So there's your satellite. I'm giving you a close up. It's inexpensive to run, but compared with Iridium, it's nothing like as prompt. Six messages 6 hours, three, 4 messages a day might be all you get, but you work out how to design around that. And now smartening, I did want to make a reference to. Somebody said that on the chat, I see that we shouldn't have we shouldn't necessarily have our windmill. Maybe we have a water pump that is using the solar power. But if we did have a windmill, then somebody has to smarten that windmill. Somebody has to give it smarts so that it can report as part of the IoT system. And that is a very useful thing to be involved in, smartening devices that are already in the field. They're commonly in use, but they can't lock into IoT projects without some smartening. Thanks, Jane. Let's go to the next one. So now we've got our second project, and we've got less time to talk about it than we did. So let me see, speaking of smartening, if I can smarten up a bit. So this one is a drone. You see the drone there. I explained that it's not the sort of drone that you actually expect to be used. We all know what drones look like, don't we? Because unfortunately, most of the use of drones is very negative. They are used to kill people. And what we've discovered is that drones are going to be very much commonplace in future wars, from what we've observed in Ukraine. But in any case, that's not our point. What our point here is that there are good uses of drones, and here is a case in point. By the way, the drone project that I'm involved with that delivers vaccines in Malawi and Mozambique, that actually is the business of a former pilot with the Royal Australian Air Force. And he wanted to do something with his aeronautical skills that, particularly skills in navigation and the like, which were different from flying jets. And that's what he did. And that's a bit what our opportunity is too. We can do stuff that turns the models and the paradigms on their head. Drones for good, as people like to say. In this case, the drone is talking via Iridium satellite, that's up the top left-hand corner, and it's also talking via a cellular network. And this is a lovely, complex project, and it's the reason I chose it. I partly chose it because of drones for good, but I also chose it because I like this idea that somebody can sit in an office in Melbourne and they can fly a drone in Malawi using these comms techniques, Iridium satellite and cellular communications locally in the country. And when you think about, it reminds me of the joke about the 737 when it was first launched. How many people does it take to fly a 737? And the answer is one pilot and a dog. The pilot is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to bite the pilot if he or she touches anything. And it's that idea that planes fly themselves. Of course, in the last few years, we've seen a number of examples where a pilot was definitely and desperately needed to fly the plane and couldn't always keep it in the air. So we've learned something about that. But this is a lovely example of how you can define a comms system which is capable of almost immediate responsiveness. So the person sitting at the desk here in Australia normally, via the cloud and the database, is able to talk to that drone via Iridium satellite two-directionally and via cellular networks. One of the great things about this particular example is that frequently those drones take off with one cellular network, they fly with the Iridium network for navigation, and then they land with a different cellular network when they get to their destination. So you can imagine whoever put that clever piece of, I'm going to call it IoT logic, together, not only experimented quite a bit, but was a very clever engineer. And one of the things I want to say, and I'll forget to say it if I don't say it soon, so I'll say it now, is that they have put together and made widely available what we'll call a platform. So you don't have to reinvent that wheel. You don't have to be able to write the code and design the boards that sit inside the drone that talk to satellite and talk to cellular and can switch cellular networks on the fly, as it were, and can switch to Iridium if they have to, and do all of that in both directions, and do that over the top of the drone being aware of where it is, how high it needs to be wherever it is, how much power it will require to get where it's going, all of those things which are engineered into this design. And yet, fundamental to this is a pilot. They don't make any trips without a pilot. They don't need a pilot. Any amount of clevers in the design has not obviated the need for for someone to sit there and look at the screen and push an occasional button. Actually, they don't push many buttons. It's a little bit like a modern jet airliner, where there are all sorts of things that pilots do, but all of it is a little bit removed from what the plane is actually calculating that it needs and doing for itself.
That comms design is like the inverse of a least cost routing system. It's a most efficient routing system with a lot of applications for other people.
Indeed, absolutely right. And so that is being made available in the context of drones, but in other contexts too. It's being made available as a platform.
Yep.
And that particular design you can buy as a platform service, as it were, and it comes with all the comms and all the connections and all the smart programming built in, and is the drone for good, which I really like. We can press on, Shane,
Yep.
and in the next slide, we've got the application element, and probably the only thing that we need, because we really discussed this multiple promptly responsive comms, how to be able to sit here and steer a drone over there at the other end of the world. But part of that is because Iridium works everywhere, and part of it is because it's got a smart SIM card in it that can really work on almost any network. Nice question. So it is getting a bit dark here. I can't see my notes, so we'll have to finish soon, Shane. So I'm pressing on.
Excellent logic.
Yeah. Don't and here then I was going to talk about centralized brain, bidirectionality. I keep banging on about this, but it's so crucial. Not just taking information, but being able to control the device is so important. And in this application, of course, completely so. And here we have the rancher and the researcher again. And you see them both. I gave you pictures of them both. Not clear whether the male is the rancher and the female is the researcher, but that's probably right. But the fact that these projects can not only deliver a vaccine over a long distance, but very often can deliver a vaccine to a location where you couldn't deliver it by road. Infrastructure very often is not available to do it that way, and so drone is absolutely ideal for that purpose. And Shane, if you go on to the next slide, in fact the one after that, then I think this is the thing that I really want to emphasize towards the conclusion of that example. Drones for good. We've seen drones wreaking terrible havoc in war zones, but here we see drones doing something good. We can see that there's an application not only in distribution of medical supplies, but there's a lovely example of that in these use of drones, because, and it's what we might call backloading. It was soon enough realised that if you sent a pack of vaccines a couple of 100 kilometres in a drone, then you would fly it back empty. Well, what was the point of that? So straight away, people said, "Well, why don't we put specimens in the return flight?" And so special bags were developed, and so now people who perhaps had an operation and needed some sort of testing of a specimen would send that back in the drone to the hospital where the facility was available to do that. And even in this case, normally by SMS, you could communicate, but the drone, of course, has a way of storing messages which can be delivered very quickly as well. These drones can photograph deforestation, and in fact, they are doing that. So that's another important application of these drones. And as I say, they have the benefit of extending the platform to other applications. But look at the picture. I love this picture because you might imagine a drone, pretty sophisticated gadget, and it's being flown maybe by somebody in Australia, and the technology is a bit private, and we'll have to send a whole lot of people over there to run the system on the ground. But you don't. And the opportunity for all sorts of people who are at home there, whose lives depend on these services, are involved in the delivery of them. And so there are a few white faces there and a few non-white faces. Actually, I think they're mostly non-white faces. So I love that aspect, and I strongly endorse the drone project I work with. They've been training anybody who was keen to know, interested in being involved, and almost all of their on-the-ground support and engineering is now done by people who were born in the place and have grown up in it. So I think there you are, opportunity, not only opportunity for those of us that might have done an IT degree and think that the world owes us something, but those of us who might have called in tonight from Malawi, for example, and everybody deserves that opportunity, and I like the fact that IoT projects provide it. Where do we go, Shane, next?
I think we might just pause for questions and
good.
deal with those out, because we'll be closing questions in about 8 minutes. There's a couple of questions about integrating 5G communications or with either ultra dense low Earth orbit satellites, and what are the challenges with that? Or what's
yes, and
5G?
And this is a live question. Really for all of us, isn't it? This idea that your mobile phone might be able to talk to a Starlink satellite or whatever, instead of having to talk to a cell tower. I think the conventional wisdom is that these won't be, in the immediate future, these won't be IoT projects normally, and that IoT will need to and will find itself exploiting Cat-M1 and NB-IoT and related terrestrial networks, and then low Earth orbit satellite, and the two won't merge for the time being. But I might be completely wrong about that. What I do know is that Telstra are planning, the main Australian carrier, are planning a major push of low Earth orbit IoT next year. And some of us are positioning ourselves to be involved in those conversations. But we will see. Easy for me to be wrong about that. What I'm sure I'm not wrong about is that there's lots of opportunity in IoT, and if we are a bit careful in the way we are involved, we respect people's privacy, and we and we are good with our engineering, then there's opportunity for all of us, wherever we are, I think.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions around the exception reporting on the CAGR application, in the sense that how much stuff are we missing by depending upon only the exception reporting?
Yes. Well, if we design really carefully, then we should get a reliable daily snapshot. But we don't need to have the capability of huge amounts of data transmission to be sure about that. We had an iridium project. Shane knows about this because he was involved in it a little bit at the time, where the device was attached to a big front end loader, and that front end loader picked up about 3 tons or whatever it was in the scoop of coal with each movement. And it would just go backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards over the same over the same track. And because every time it winked an eye, it sent a report to Iridium, it was costing about $1,000 US a month in overages to report something that we could perfectly well predict. All we really needed to know was a count of how many times it did it in a day, which you could pretty much report in 2 bytes of data. So it's that design, if and where we can, which really doesn't deprive us of much information, but the really rich information we might have to pick up once a year when we come past on the motorcycle with a USB stick.
That's more for doing like long-term trending reports and the like, exception data, because you're dealing, as you said, with a known base of predicted behavior. It's about anything that differs from the rule, and you try and report on all of those things as much as you can and cram it on one thing.
Yep.
Tim's asked, and I think you sort of answered this anyway. He said, is the drone autonomous? But you said it had a pilot. How does essentially, I think he's gobsmacked that it's getting away with running it across Iridium, which is essentially not much better than GPRS speeds, I would imagine, still, all the way across, a couple of 100 miles via a drone. Particularly as the pilot is in Melbourne, and you probably got what, half a second delay.
Yes, yeah, and it was tested in northern Victoria, and we developed this software, hardware and software, firmware, and I think they're probably there were a couple of really smart guys involved in that. I wasn't one of them, and what they essentially said is, this is what we need to do. How can we do it with what's available? And that's the result. They know where those drones are. There's a little bit of prediction involved. The actual flight paths are assumed to some extent, but yes, it's almost like somebody is flying it with a little bit of a delay, like playing an organ as opposed to playing a piano.
I would imagine that's where it's important that things like local weather conditions are critical information. If you've got crosswinds and the like pushing it off track. Last couple of questions, then we'll move on to your last thing and we'll wrap it up tonight. A couple of people have been asking about how to match the cows up and everything, and I can answer that. There's collars that get put on it with little IoT devices that talk either via NFC or Bluetooth or LoRaWAN, as you said in the example, which are all different forms of low volume, short range, free wireless communications, based upon having a little base station And presumably there's a little base station in your smart box. And when the cows come within range of it, their little collars download data. They in fact probably download a whole pile of tracking data, I would imagine, on where they roam during the day and what they get up to, and as well as some health information and whether they've drunk and all of that sort of stuff. And that's basically how that works. And yes, the collars occasionally get lost or get mangled, but that's probably less often than you might think. And in fact, that gives you the impetus when something happens and the collar stops reporting in. That appears as if the cow's gone missing in that case, and you look for where the collar stopped reporting in and start heading out towards that if you want to save your cow, which is worth a lot of money to any rancher.
Yes, and you might send a drone these days.
You might send a drone, exactly, rather than a helicopter trip. And Gonzalo's asking if they, drones only seem to be able to go 18 Ks, but these ones are actually running, you said, a couple of 100 kilometers before.
Yeah.
Nice one, Tim. Nice one. It's when you activate the drone ranger.
Yep. 250 kilometers, and then new charge battery, and away they go back.
Yeah. Okay, that's the end of the questions that we've got for the moment. We're going to close questions pretty much now, so you've got about a minute to get any last ones in. And what I would suggest is that, Jeff, why don't you talk about your newfound project from yesterday?
Oh, yes. So this is rather fun. I thought it illustrated the point that we've made a few times. And I was in a meeting yesterday with my good friends from Teltonica, who make all sorts of electronic devices, many of them used in IoT projects. And now they've just launched their health watch. It's a good watch. You can see the time on it. It's always handy for a watch. And actually, if you scroll down the strap below the watch, you'll see a terminal there. Shane is pointing it out. And there are 4 terminals on the back of the watch. I should have photographed front and back, shouldn't I? And so what you do is you undo the bottom button of your shirt, and you hold the strap against your tummy on the left-hand side, and then after a certain period of time, your ECG will turn up. So there is an ECG there that's got a bit of a red mark on it. That's not mine, by the way. Oddly enough, in the ECG that I took yesterday, only the left side of my heart was working, but they assured me that that was a problem with the device. So it's, but what I found very interesting was this was a device they'd manufactured. It's not the first health watch, surely, although it'll be a lot less expensive than say an Apple Watch or the like. But it's that they have designed this without a SIM card. Doesn't do it won't really monitor your health while you're out and about, but it does discover all sorts of interesting observations about your health if you want to go to the trouble of undoing the bottom button of your shirt. So it's and I found that really intriguing because I'd never heard about this device. We just said, oh, are you guys interested in IoT health? And they said, well, funny you should ask. Here's our new watch. So I thought to myself, that's an example of opportunity. And in fact, we said to them, we are a bit keen on finding a way to be involved in this project. Since you happen to have mentioned it, apparently, before you mentioned it to anybody else, you never know. Why don't you and we work together on it? And it's opportunity, and in fact, good opportunity. Now, we haven't time to talk, and let's not, about the difficulty of getting doctors to participate, but we'll that'd come up for another occasion. But I liked it as an illustration of how IoT projects are all around you if you look for them. Thank you, Shane.
I hate to be the devil's advocate here, but I will say that it looks like another great project without a business case.
Indeed.
If they haven't got doctors on board and they haven't got hospitals on board or a research company on board, they've got a great idea, and this is what I would call a prototype.
Yes.
And so therefore they now need to build a business case for it without, and knowing Teltonika, who are a great manufacturer and manufacture things very cheaply. I think they're based in Lithuania originally.
Yes, yep.
They have great products, but again, it's a product looking for a reason to be. And why wouldn't they, for example, manufacture it with Bluetooth in, so it would talk to you an application on your smartphone?
Yes,
As does the Apple Watch and all the others. That just seems somewhat, underthought. But having just dissed it, I mean, it looks like fantastic technology. I can see all the applications that you can, but I think the hard work is now in front of them to make this a commercially viable product. How do you get it in front of people? How do you sell it? You could go down the road of putting it in Aldi stores, for example, in supermarkets. I bought a blood pressure monitor from a supermarket like that, which a couple of years ago, and it works brilliantly. And it just gives me the data because I want to monitor things myself. So if I had a heart health problem, I might want an ECG that I could look at myself. But then again, if I've got real trouble, I'm not going to be fiddling around trying to get the outputs of it either, am I? I would want a service to monitor it for me and arrange for an ambulance to be called if something went wrong. Anyway, they're all very intriguing, both business, ethical, and logistical questions that I think these guys need to answer before they've got an actual product. And it looks like you've faded into black, Jeff. Has your phone run out of screen?
Oh, did that happen just then?
Well, I think you're just a bit far away from the phone for it to light up your face. I've got big screens in front of me, so mine does light up. I feel like I'm doing Mastermind now. If anyone remembers that TV show from the 70s, 80s.
I hope nobody on the call is unhappy with us being in the dark, Shane.
Hopefully they're not in the dark.
Yeah. It's beautiful here where I'm sitting outside. It's such a balmy evening. And I even though I can't see my notes, I'm not sorry as long as no one else is sorry.
Yeah. One last question. Stephen's asked here. It's a question that answers itself. He said, do these projects, which are the bleeding edge, need to be viable economic business sense for them to go ahead? And the short answer is yes. The long answer is yes. But you'd be surprised how many projects which are bleeding edge go ahead anyway, no matter the fact that they don't have the business cases. We spent a fair bit of time in the first few weeks talking about that. And there's really good reasons why they go ahead. Sometimes it's research. Sometimes it's to prove we can do it. Sometimes it's because somebody's got a bee in their bonnet and they want to make it happen no matter what. Like this, this watch, it's a bit like the asthma puffer that we saw many years ago, which had a monitor in it. And he had a business need because he could see that, it was obvious that young children who were prescribed the normal asthma puffers, the Ventolins and the like, if the ones that went to hospital with bad asthma attacks and died were the ones that didn't regularly take their puffer. So if you could monitor that remotely and keep reminding them, then you had a chance of that not happening. However, he couldn't get people on board to do it because it was expensive. As Prasanna is saying, developing the product is a very complex process. There's a lot of regulations with anything to do with health. And that would be partly why they would shy away from doing a more integrated approach on the watch, for example, because once you start making it predictive, then you've got all sorts of government implications. But even so, there's still, to a certain extent, the hard work is really yet to be done on those. And that's what I would consider in some respects, the real work of those things, because we've been able to envisage these sorts of watch applications for at least a good 10 years. We if you recall, Jeff, we had a cellular smartphone Dick Tracy style watch about 10 or 15 years ago. And again, it was a product without a business market. Nobody really wanted it at that stage because while phones were still fairly large, they did fit in your hand, and there was no real advantage from using it on your, bringing your elbow up to talk to your mouth all the time was not actually seen as a benefit. And people had stopped wearing watches to a lesser or greater extent because they're really a fashion prestige jewelry item these days. You don't need a watch to tell you the time anymore. You have a phone, you have a car, you have the microwave, you have the TV, all of which have times on them at various times. So you don't actually need a watch in the same way that you might have 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. Last thing to say about that, Shane, is our first example, complex process. The rancher really benefits from it. The researcher piggybacks on that. The two come together for mutual benefit. And very often it's going to be like that. One commercial, one academic, intellectual, working together to produce a viable project.
Ironically, Jeff, that is exactly what IT Masters are, in that we
Oh, yeah.
I'll do the advertisement now.
Yes, yeah, do.
Our postgraduate courses are part academic and part led by industry mentors, people such as yourself who work in the industry all the time, and that's what we see as one of the nice things about what we do. It's probably that time of the night where I again please ask anybody who's interested to fill out the survey that is beyond the exam. The exam will be opened up tomorrow morning Australian time, so in about 15 hours from now we'll open the exam up. Otherwise, there are all sorts of links being put on the screen by Lil, who's doing a fabulous job doing all of that sort of stuff this evening and herding on the webinar chat. And I think it's time to say good night. And thank you so much for attending our 4-week short course on the Internet of Things. We're hoping that you found it enjoyable and interesting and informative above all else, and it encourages you to do more study. Our postgraduate courses are not much different to this in general terms, and that's why we give credits for people that do 3 of our short courses. They can get a credit into one of our postgraduate subjects, for example. But yes, thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure to work with you again. It's been a few years.
Thank you very much, Shane. Me too. Thank you to you and Lil and everyone who joined.
And yes,
nice to work with you.
Yeah, been great to have everybody's input, and there's been some great forum discussions as well all the way through. So we love to see that stuff, and we welcome you along. By the way, one last reminder, people who are accessing the short course website, it will be down for maintenance between the 23rd of October and the 1st of November. We're rebuilding the whole thing from the ground up, and we need to take it off air for about a week. So please be aware of that. There'll be a notice on the site saying it's down. And we look forward to seeing you on the other side. Have a great couple of days and a great few weeks. See you later.
Thank you.